What are your recommendations for choosing or avoiding artificial sweeteners, and why are these decisions significant for metabolic health?
Yeah, so there's huge implications here because why would someone do an artificial sweetener or add a sweetener? Because people like sweet flavors. It's not and it shouldn't be wrong for that, right? People love, that's why sugar has become the enemy for many when talking about metabolic health, because we know that sugar is often overconsumed and it's highly palatable. It tastes super good, so you want to consume a lot of it. And so when people are trying to find effective strategies to lower caloric intake and lose weight, sugar is one of the easiest places to look to say, oh, you should probably reduce that. That'll help reduce your caloric intake and lower calories. So like things like sugar in liquids that you can drink, that's like a low hanging fruit to try to remove that from the diet to lose weight. But people still want to feel that same level of satisfaction from, let's say, their coffee if they had sugar in it, or they want to make for a cake, for a birthday cake. They don't want it to taste like like sourdough bread. Maybe they want it to taste like a sugary cake. And so there are a number of ways of doing that. And historically, people look to artificial sweeteners. So chemically induced or chemically created sweeteners. And some of those include things like sucralose or aspartame or one of these other types, because they taste sweet. They may taste similar to sugar, maybe not identical. But the problem with including them is, one, yes, you are replacing a lot of calories in the form of sugar with something that tastes potentially very equivalent. It doesn't have those calories. That's a huge win for people to have that. The problem, though, is that some of these aren't benign. Some of these actually appear when consumed at high enough levels for a long enough period of time that originally the research says, well, doesn't really look there's any potential harm. At least most of the literature. If you looked at animal data where they consumed it at high levels over a long period of time, you did see concerns. But if you looked at some of the human data, it really didn't show a lot of harmful effects. But then there was an emergence of data in more controlled trials where they were administering something called sucralose when consumed over sustained periods of time at levels that people actually do consume them in everyday society. We're developing things like insulin resistance. And this really raised some alarm bells for a lot of people because that illustrated they're not just a supplement for glucose to lower calories, but they're actually potentially harmful if consumed consistently over time. Is it still better than consuming a ton of calories and sugar? Probably. But is it for free? No. At least some of the data suggests that. So then the question is, what should I consume if I still want to have some sweet type of flavor? And so, generally speaking, people have shifted towards away from artificial sweeteners to naturally derived sweeteners. And that could mean things like monk fruit, stevia, or allulose. Now, when you look at the literature, there is some actual emergent evidence in these different natural sweeteners. And it certainly seems that these appear to be very, very safe sweeteners. But even because a lot of them are derived from fruits like dates or other um, ingredients, they just concentrate it and you can consume it. And things like stevia or allulose or monk fruit, that reduces a lot of concern because if it's coming from a plant, doesn't mean it's necessarily healthy, but it definitely makes you feel a little more comfortable than consuming something that's completely artificial. Because if it's in a plant that we have consumed, at least we know what small quantities that was in that plant that should in theory be safe. But artificial, you never know until you actually try it and include it for long enough in someone's diet. So of those natural sweeteners, if they're inherently appear to be safer just at first glance, and also the evidence seems to suggest that, which of those do you choose? And that's a very interesting question to me, one that's way more interesting to me now than it ever used to be, because a lot of, well, not a lot of these, but some of these are actually not just sugar alternatives that are extremely low or have no calories whatsoever. I have observed, at least in some of the emergent evidence in animals, but also in myself, that there is some potential metabolic effects of some of these natural sweeteners. And one of those is actually allulose. So allulose, the reason I'm so interested in this topic is because for so long I viewed these as just caloric substitutes. Okay, you have all this dense calories and sugar that you get very little metabolic benefit from. In fact, it could be metabolically damaging, especially consumed chronically over time. Just remove those. Okay, if you can just remove them and provide something that tastes similar and gets people off sugar, win. Uh, but then when I'm starting to look at the literature of something specifically like allulose, you start seeing all this emergent evidence in rodents that say it has this anti-obesity and anti-diabetic effect, specifically type 2 diabetes. And okay, you say, okay, well, is that just reducing weight? It's, well, no, there's actually a lot of what they call incretin effects of this of sweetener. Now, what's interesting about allulose is it's what they call a C3 epimer of fructose. I'm sure many people have heard of high fructose corn syrup. It's almost certainly the devil, or the terrible form of sugar. It's super highly palatable, has negative health consequences. Fructose more so than glucose does, or sugar does. And so many people have heard of how terrible that is. Well, it's actually a C3 epimer. So you take one of the molecules and you flip it. Well, by flipping it, one, you still get the sweet flavor, but you make it largely non-digestive, meaning that it's not metabolized into ATP, and then as a result is calories. But it is absorbed by the body, and the body does process it. And what's interesting is that it induces a high elevation of endogenous GLP-1. It also appears in animals. It also appears to lower glucagon and ultimately lower glucose. And then as a result, also lower insulin. But these are all in animals. Well, there's this emergent evidence in humans that when you consume this, it also has a potent effect on having similar incretin effects in humans. So emergent evidence says that it also induces endogenous GLP-1. And if you induce or elevate endogenous GLP-1, then you're talking about these other changes as well, like potential for lowering glucagon and other effects from something that has virtually no calories and does taste sweet. But then there was these two studies, again, very preliminary, but that has suggested that people who are overweight and or obese when consuming it with sugar, it can attenuate the impact of the glucose, how high the glucose, so an oral glucose tolerance test in essence, not exactly one, but analogous one, it blunted the glucose rise, but also lowered insulin. So that's a remarkable potential of something that tastes sweet and is an alternative to sugar, but that might have a positive metabolic effect. But then there was another study for individuals who underwent Ramadan. Now, Ramadan is a religious practice where people don't eat for extended periods of time. And what they found is that people with type 2 diabetes who were during Ramadan, when they added allulose to their refeeding, so when they refeed during Ramadan, just adding allulose blunted the glucose rise of that meal. But it was a very uncontrolled setup or study. But we're about to publish some emergent evidence, the first ever in type 1 diabetes, in a very controlled setup that I think will open a lot of people's eyes to its metabolic potential, not necessarily as a just safe, natural sugar with a sweet flavor, but actually having powerful metabolic potential, therapeutic potential at that. And so it's not out yet, but when it does come out, I'm looking forward to sharing it with people to highlight that, not all sweeteners are the same, natural versus artificial, but even all of the natural forms, not all are metabolically equivalent. And that's for sure. In fact, Ben Bikman's group out of BYU has recently published some work in animals showing that, having allulose on top of a Western diet reduces caloric intake, obesity in animals, but also Paul Reynolds at BYU as well, who studies glycation. So this process of how glucose attaches to tissues and potentially can cause damage or inflammation within the body, something called AGEs or AGEs. And he also published a study showing the potential of allulose to attenuate the accumulation of AGEs as well in cells. And so there's more to come for sure. And this emergent study is going to be highlighting in humans. And so this will be, I think, a really eye-opening assessment for people to see.
Right.